The quiet hum of the ship's engine reverberated through the metallic walls, a sound that had become as familiar as the crew's own heartbeat. It was the kind of hum that signaled normalcy routine. There was nothing special about it, no reason to believe anything was different. And yet, something felt off. A flicker in the corner of their eyes, a whisper in the static, a feeling in their bones that something wasn't right. It had started innocently enough, like any other mission, a standard recon to the outskirts of known space. But as the crew ventured deeper into the unknown, they realized that this mission would be anything but ordinary. Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content. The signal had come through first, a faint transmission, fragmented and weak. It wasn't the kind of signal they were used to receiving. No distress, no call for help, no warning of danger. Instead, it was a puzzle. The signal, encoded in a way they couldn't immediately decipher, came from a ship that didn't appear on any chart, from a location no one had mapped. The coordinates were a mystery. The data was almost completely corrupted, but there was just enough to spark their curiosity. It seemed harmless at first, an anomaly worth investigating. Kind of thing a crew trained for deep space exploration might dismiss on any other day, but something about it pulled them in. As the crew drew closer, the mystery deepened. There was no sign of life aboard the vessel they were approaching, no indication of anyone at the helm or anywhere within the hull. The ship drifted in the emptiness of space, suspended in the cold void like a forgotten relic. It was strange. Too strange. The first officer had suggested they turn back, but the captain insisted they board. It was too perfect of a puzzle to leave unsolved. They had come this far, and the answers were just within reach. Upon boarding the ship, the silence was suffocating. The air felt stale, untouched by human presence, for what seemed like years. Yet, despite the complete absence of life, the crew couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. They weren't sure if it was the eerie quiet or the feeling of unseen eyes watching them, but every footstep seemed to echo too loudly in the cold, abandoned halls. And the deeper they ventured into the ship, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the stillness that made them uncomfortable. It was the signs that something had been there before someone. But there were no bodies, no remains, no traces of life, only remnants of a crew that had once called this place home. As they explored the ship, the crew found the ship's logs, an unbroken record of its mission. The logs were outdated, full of corruption and broken data, but fragments remained. Whoever had been on board before them had recorded their experiences, their thoughts, and strangely warnings. The most chilling of these warnings was simple, a phrase repeated again and again in the captain's final entries: "Do not trust the lights." At first, it seemed like a cryptic, almost nonsensical message. But as they delved deeper into the ship's systems, strange occurrences began to unfold. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The crew members' own reflections in the polished surfaces seemed wrong. They would turn, and in the corner of their vision, something would be there, something that wasn't there a second before. The logs became more frantic as the entries continued. The captain's tone shifted from curiosity to panic, describing things that made no sense: flashes of movement, voices in the walls, and the lights. The lights, which had once been a comforting, familiar part of the ship, now seemed to have a life of their own. The flickers weren't just malfunctioning lights. They were signs. A presence, an intelligence that was using the ship's systems, drawing them in. The warnings were clear: do not trust the lights. But what did it mean? What could possibly be wrong with something as simple as a light? One of the crew members found a compartment deep within the ship, hidden away behind a panel that seemed to have been sealed intentionally. Inside was a small room, lined with old machinery. Yet, as soon as they stepped inside, the air changed. It became heavy, thick, as if the space itself was alive. There, hidden in the far corner, was a terminal. The screen flickered to life as they approached, revealing an image that none of them could have prepared for. It was a visual recording, an image from the ship's past, a previous crew, a glimpse into the ship's final moments before everything had gone quiet. But there was something wrong about the image. The people in the recording, the crew, they weren't entirely human. At least, not anymore. The crew member pulled away, a chill running down their spine. As they moved to leave the room, something caught their eye, a shadow moving behind them, out of sync with their own movements. They froze, heart racing, but when they turned around, there was nothing. Just the hum of the ship, the flicker of the lights. But that moment, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, lingered. The captain, too, began to feel the presence. At first, it was subtle. A shadow in the hallway that never seemed to belong to anyone. A whisper that couldn't be traced. But soon, it escalated. Doors that shouldn't open, equipment that malfunctioned without explanation. The crew's initial excitement at uncovering the secrets of the ship began to sour, replaced by fear. Fear of what they might uncover, fear of what might be lurking just beyond their sight, hidden in the corners of the ship. The lights, the one thing they had taken for granted on board, had now become a source of terror. They began to suspect that the lights themselves were the key to understanding what had happened to the previous crew. But what was it about the lights that had driven them to leave behind only warnings? Every time the lights flickered, the crew felt the presence grow stronger. It was as if the ship itself was alive, aware of their every move. The deeper they went into the heart of the ship, the more they realized that they were not just investigating an abandoned vessel. They were entering a memory, a ghost of a crew that had long since been consumed by whatever force haunted the ship. But what had become of them? Where had they gone? And most importantly, who or what was watching them now? It was only when they reached the ship's central core, the heart of the vessel, that they finally understood. The ship's systems had been corrupted, altered by whatever intelligence now inhabited its walls. The lights weren't just malfunctioning, they were guiding them, drawing them closer to something that had been waiting. Something that wanted them to find it. The crew gathered at the core, staring at the glowing, pulsating energy that hummed like a living thing. The lights flickered again, and this time, it wasn't a simple malfunction. The ship's voice, a low and unearthly whisper, resonated through their comms. You shouldn't have come. You should not trust the lights. A shiver ran down their spines. They were no longer alone. The ship wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. And it had been waiting for them. The lights had drawn them in, and now they were trapped. There was no escape. What had happened to the original crew? What had they uncovered? And why had the ship waited so long to reveal its true nature? As the lights flickered one final time, the crew realized that the answers might not be what they wanted. And in that realization, the true horror of the ship's mystery began to sink in. But before they could even process what was happening, the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness. And that was when they heard it, the sound of something moving in the shadows, something that wasn't human. What awaited them in the darkness? And would they ever escape the grip of the specters in the data? As the silence settled over them, The only sound that remained was the distant hum of the ship's systems, alive, awake, and watching. The darkness that followed the flickering lights settled in like a heavy fog, suffocating and thick. Crew stood motionless, their breaths shallow and labored, each of them desperately trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around them. Their minds raced with questions, but none of the answers seemed to make any sense. The ship's lights had gone out completely, leaving them with nothing but the disorienting hum of the engines, the soft click of the ship's systems processing unknown data, and the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. The captain gripped the rail of the command deck, her knuckles white as her eyes scanned the darkened corridors beyond. She could hear the crew moving behind her, shuffling their feet, their whispers laced with uncertainty and fear. She felt a growing sense of dread gnaw at her stomach. It wasn't just the lights or the strange occurrences, it was the presence. The ship, once silent and cold, now seemed alive. Something was stirring in its walls, a consciousness that watched them, listened to their every word, waited for them to make the wrong move. "We need to keep moving," the captain said, her voice sharp but betraying a hint of unease. "Check the secondary systems. Make sure we're not losing power. I want all communication lines open. We need to know what we're dealing with here." Her crew, loyal but visibly shaken, nodded and scattered to their stations. The silence that had followed the captain's order was broken only by the faint sounds of fingers typing on consoles, the soft beeping of data being processed. But even as they worked, the unease in the air only grew. Every beep, every flicker of a screen felt like a warning, like the ship was trying to tell them something important. But what? And who were they supposed to trust? The first officer had made his way to the ship's main data terminal, where the logs of the previous crew were stored. He'd been hoping to find some clue, some sign of what had happened to them, but what he found was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The terminal flickered as it powered up, displaying fragmented records, encrypted files, and strange images that seemed to glitch and distort in real time. His heart raced as his eyes flicked across the screen, each new piece of data more unsettling than the last. The crew's final logs were clear. The captain's last recorded entry, just days before the ship's systems went dark, was a chilling warning: do not trust the lights. They are not what they seem. We're not alone. The words echoed in his mind, matching the captain's warning that had been left behind for them to find. But why hadn't they listened? What had driven them to this point of no return? What had they discovered that had led to their disappearance? The first officer closed the terminal with trembling hands, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. But before he could process any of it, a new sound reached his ears, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty corridors. There was nothing, no movement, no signs of life. Just the hum of the ship and the flickering lights that cast long, unsettling shadows. "Did you hear that?" the first officer asked, his voice low, a trace of panic creeping in. He turned toward the captain, who had been overseeing the operations from the deck. The captain, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, nodded slowly. "I heard it too." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear to all of them now. They weren't just dealing with a malfunctioning ship. They were dealing with something far more sinister, something intelligent, something that had been watching them long before they had ever boarded this vessel. The crew regrouped, huddled together in the command center, the light from their data screens casting an eerie glow over their faces. They discussed their options in hurried whispers, each of them aware that the longer they stayed on the ship, the more they were drawing closer to whatever force lay hidden within its walls. But none of them knew where to begin. They had no clear path forward, no real understanding of what they were up against. "We need to go deeper," the captain said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. "We need to find out what happened to the previous crew. We need to understand what we're dealing with here. Only then can we make a decision about what to do next." Without another word, the crew followed her lead, moving cautiously through the darkened corridors of the ship. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, each sound amplified by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud. The deeper they went, the more the sense of unease grew. They passed rooms and hallways that had been left untouched, their contents undisturbed, frozen in time. It was as if the ship had been abandoned in a hurry, but there were no signs of a struggle, no signs of violence, just empty spaces waiting for something. Then they came across something that made their blood run cold. At first, it seemed like an ordinary room, just another part of the ship that had been left behind. But when they stepped inside, they realized something was off. The room was smaller than it should have been, cramped in a way that defied logic. There was a heavy smell in the air, like something had been decaying for a long time. And yet, the room looked pristine, almost untouched. But the strangest part was what they found at the center of the room. A single chair. It sat alone in the middle of the room, positioned as if someone had just left it moments ago. There was no dust, no signs of age. But the chair was positioned directly beneath one of the ship's overhead lights, its illumination casting sharp shadows across the floor. And that was when they realized there was something wrong with the light. It didn't flicker like the others. It wasn't just malfunctioning, it was alive. The light seemed to pulse with energy, as if it was drawing power from something deep within the ship, something ancient and forgotten. And worse yet, the shadows it cast were shifting. They weren't static. They moved, almost as if they had a mind of their own. "Captain," the first officer said, his voice trembling, "there's something in this room. Something wrong with the light." The captain didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the chair, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she turned to the crew. "We need to leave," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. The crew jumped back in shock, their hearts racing. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into total darkness. Panic set in as they scrambled to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if the ship itself was holding them captive, refusing to let them go. Suddenly, the lights returned, and in their cold, harsh glow, the room felt suffocating. The captain's voice broke through the tense silence. "We have to find a way to communicate with the ship. We need to understand why it's doing this." But before they could make a move, another voice, a voice that was not their own, echoed through the ship's comm system, low and distorted, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." The crew froze. That voice, it wasn't human. It was something else. Something old. Something powerful. And in that moment, they realized that they weren't just trapped inside a derelict vessel. They were being hunted. The ship wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The lights flickered again. And this time, when they looked up, they saw something standing in the shadows, something that wasn't human at all. The air grew colder. The ship seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and as the crew stood frozen in place, they understood. They were never meant to find this ship. And now, it was too late. The specters that haunted the data, that lurked in the shadows, were real. And they weren't going to let the crew leave. The whispers in the dark grew louder. The lights grew brighter. And somewhere deep within the bowels of the ship, the ancient force that had been lying dormant for centuries stirred, ready to reveal itself. The crew had made a fatal mistake by boarding the ship. They thought they had come to investigate an abandoned vessel. But now they knew the truth. They had unwittingly become part of a much larger, far more terrifying story. And there was no going back. What awaited them in the darkness? Would they ever uncover the secrets of the ship, or would they become part of its long, twisted history? As the lights flickered once more, the crew braced themselves for whatever was coming next. The atmosphere grew thicker, heavier with each passing moment. The crew huddled together, their collective unease growing with every flicker of the lights, every unexplained sound that echoed through the ship's vast, empty halls. The comm system, once reliable and secure, now only emitted static, the voices of those who had spoken moments ago, fading like forgotten whispers. The walls of the ship, once just a backdrop to their mission, now felt like they were closing in. They were not alone, not by a long shot. And the ship itself seemed determined to prove that. The captain, though visibly shaken, maintained a stoic composure. She had seen many things in her career, but this was different. This wasn't just a malfunction or an unexpected anomaly. There was something intentionally malevolent at play here, something deliberate, something ancient lurking beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the words of the warning, the cryptic message, "Do not trust the lights," kept repeating in her mind, a constant drumbeat of foreboding. The crew exchanged glances, none of them brave enough to speak. The first officer, the one who had been so eager to dive into the mystery of the ship's data logs, now looked like a man on the edge of collapse. His hand, which had previously hovered over the terminal with determination, now trembled slightly. It wasn't just the growing realization of their dire situation that unnerved him. It was the fact that they hadn't seen the full extent of what lay beneath the ship's eerie exterior. What had driven the previous crew to abandon the ship? What had they found, and why were they now silent, their voices nothing more than a distortion in the ship's systems? "We need to get to the central hub," the captain said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, though a crack of fear trembled at the edge of her words. "We need to override the ship's systems. There has to be something there, something we can use." Crew nodded in agreement, but their movements were slow, reluctant. None of them knew what awaited them ahead, but they had no choice. There was no turning back now. Whatever had caused the death of the original crew, or had driven them to madness, was still out there, somewhere within the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. As they moved deeper into the ship, the tension only escalated. The walls, once sterile and lifeless, now seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The lights flickered again, briefly plunging them into complete darkness, and when they returned, they were dimmer, colder, as though the ship had consumed some piece of itself in order to further tighten its grip on them. "We're not alone," whispered one of the crew members, her voice trembling. The captain turned to her, sharply. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear. "I saw something moving, in the shadows." Another crew member stepped forward. "What do you mean, moving? Could it have been one of us?" "No," she replied, her voice low and strained. "It was something else. Something not human." The words hung in the air, chilling everyone to the core. Something else. The idea that they weren't alone on this ship, that there were other forces at play, had always been a distant possibility, a theory. But now it was a reality. There was no denying it. Whatever had driven the previous crew to their doom, whatever haunted the ship's darkened corridors, was real, and it was getting closer. The captain's eyes darted around the dim hallway. The ship was too vast to navigate on a hunch, too complex to understand in mere hours. They had to find the central hub, They had to understand what the ship was hiding. But with each step they took, they only seemed to descend deeper into an unknown abyss. They rounded another corner, and suddenly the temperature seemed to drop. Their breath misted in the air. The lights above buzzed ominously, as though protesting their intrusion. Then, one of the crew members, who had been trailing behind, let out a startled gasp. "Captain, look!" The man pointed towards the wall ahead. The captain's gaze followed his finger, and her heart stopped. There, etched into the metal wall, in a way that seemed unnatural, too precise to be a simple scratch or marking, was a symbol. It was alien in design, intricate, almost fluid in its composition. The lines seemed to pulse with a faint glow, radiating a pale, sickly light. "Is it?" The first officer hesitated, his voice trailing off. Captain approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving the symbol. Her mind raced. It looked like nothing they had encountered before. It didn't match any known alien script, no insignia from any species they had encountered in their travels. But it wasn't the symbol itself that unsettled her. It was the fact that it was there at all. The ship's surfaces, which should have been cold, metallic, and devoid of any organic markings, were now alive with this unnatural etching. She reached out to touch it, but her fingers hovered inches from the surface. Something told her not to. Something deep inside warned her that to do so would be a grave mistake. "Do you feel that?" one of the crew members asked, his voice barely a whisper. The captain nodded slowly. "Yeah, I feel it." There was an energy in the air, an oppressive weight that seemed to press in from all sides. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. But what? Before anyone could answer, a sudden blast of static burst through the comm system. The crew winced, their hands instinctively reaching for their ears, but the static didn't stop. It built, became more pronounced, more forceful, until, with a burst of distorted sound, a voice broke through. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was harsh, distorted, but it was undeniably human. Or at least, it sounded human. There was an edge of something else, though. An underlying tone that sent chills down the crew's spines. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command, a statement, a truth. "What was that?" one of the crew members demanded, his voice shaking with panic. Who's speaking?" The captain raised her hand, signaling for silence. She didn't know the answer, but she had a sinking feeling that they had just been given their first real warning, a warning from the ship itself, or whatever entity controlled it. The air in the corridor seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping even further as the static continued to hum. Another sound broke through the silence. A thudding noise, distant yet unmistakable. It came from deep within the ship, from the heart of its core. A rhythmic beat, as if something or someone was moving, waiting, preparing for the next phase of whatever twisted game the ship was playing. "We need to keep moving," the captain said, her voice steady, though the tension in her eyes was unmistakable. "We need answers. And we need them fast." Crew nodded, their faces pale, but there was no time for hesitation. With renewed urgency, they pressed on, moving through the dark corridors, past the haunting symbols and flickering lights. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker, pressing in on them, and every now and then they would hear something, a distant scrape, a soft whisper, an unintelligible voice calling from the darkness. The ship was alive, and whatever haunted it was not going to let them leave without answering the most crucial question of all: what had happened to the crew before them? As they continued deeper into the ship, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. That something was right behind them, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But they couldn't stop now. They had no choice. The deeper they went, the closer they came to the truth, whatever it was. And as the sound of the approaching footsteps echoed closer and closer, the crew realized with growing horror that they weren't just searching for answers. They were being hunted. The crew moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, each step heavier than the last. Corridors stretched endlessly, a maze of cold metal and flickering lights that seemed to follow their every move. The hum of the ship had become a constant, oppressive presence, an almost living thing that pulsed with malevolent energy. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. With every turn, the air grew colder, more suffocating. The temperature plummeted until it felt like the very life was being drained from the room. Every now and then, they would hear a distant sound, a soft tapping, a scraping, like something or someone moving just beyond their reach. The crew's unease deepened with each passing minute, their nerves on edge, the hairs on the back of their necks standing tall. They all felt it, the growing presence, the dark force that seemed to be closing in around them. The first officer was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, barely audible over the oppressive hum of the ship. "We are too far in. We have to turn back." But the captain refused to listen. She had been quiet for a while now, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Every answer they found led only to more confusion, more uncertainty. The message, the strange symbols, the voice in the comm system, it was all connected. The pieces were falling into place, but there was no way to understand the bigger picture without seeing it through to the end. They had come too far to turn back now. "We need to find the central hub," she said, her voice firm. "That's where we'll get the answers." Her words were met with reluctant nods from the crew. They had no choice. There was no turning back now. But as they pressed on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the ship itself was alive, breathing in the dark, and every turn they made only seemed to draw them further into its grasp. They finally reached a large door at the end of the hall, the last obstacle before the central hub. The captain placed her hand on the panel, but before she could initiate the entry sequence, the lights above them flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The crew froze, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. A cold sweat broke out on their brows. "Not again," one of the crew members whispered. "This isn't happening." But it was. And worse, something was moving in the darkness. Something close. The faintest of noises, soft footsteps, too quiet to place, but unmistakable, drifted from the shadows. It was hard to tell if it was human, alien, or something else entirely. It was just wrong. Crew's breath caught in their throats as they instinctively backed away from the door. The captain reached for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. It trembled in her hand, and for a moment, the crew could see her struggle to keep calm. She could feel the cold breath of fear on the back of her neck, her senses screaming that something was wrong. "Stay calm," she said, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep it steady. "We're almost there. We have to get inside." The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. It was almost as if the light itself was being absorbed by the ship. She looked at the crew, her gaze flicking from one terrified face to the next, and she knew they could sense it too, their every instinct telling them to run, to flee, but they couldn't. They had to finish what they had started. With a deep breath, the captain activated the door. The metal groaned as it slid open with a slow, reluctant hiss. Beyond, the central hub awaited, its darkened interior teeming with the unknown. They stepped inside, one by one, the door sliding shut behind them with a finality that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. The room was vast, an open space filled with rows of terminals and blinking lights that seemed almost too bright after the darkness of the corridor. But there was something off about it, something that didn't sit right. It wasn't the technology. It was the stillness. Crew fanned out, their footsteps echoing against the cold metal floor. Each terminal flickered to life as they approached, the screens filling with old, corrupted data. But in the midst of the static, something caught their attention. A series of symbols, once again alien in design, were flashing on one of the terminals. They were similar to the ones they had seen on the walls earlier, but these were different, darker, more intricate. One of the crew members stepped forward, his eyes wide as he analyzed the data. This is it. This is the crew's last message. Captain leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the corrupted screens. It was difficult to make out the details, but the words that appeared broken, distorted, yet still legible, sent a chill down her spine. Do not trust the lights. They are not what they seem. We are not alone. The message abruptly cut off, leaving behind only more static. The captain's heart raced. The warning had come again, but this time it was stronger, more urgent. There was something else buried in the data, a series of pictures, quick flashes of images that didn't belong on a normal screen. She could make out vague outlines of figures, shadows moving in the background, but nothing clear enough to identify. Whatever was on those screens, it was too disturbing to process all at once. "Captain, look at this," another crew member called out, her voice shaking. She pointed to a different part of the room, where a door stood slightly ajar. No one had noticed it before. It was hidden in the shadows, almost deliberately camouflaged. It was too small to be a major access point, yet something about it felt wrong, like it had been forgotten, sealed off for a reason. Captain hesitated, her hand tightening around her flashlight. The tension in the room was palpable. They had been in the ship for hours now, and with each passing minute, the sense of danger was growing. Whatever had happened to the previous crew, whatever dark force was at work here, it was still alive. It was still waiting. "Should we check it out?" one of the crew members asked. His voice was tight with fear, but there was no denying the curiosity in his tone. The captain nodded, albeit reluctantly. "We have to. There's no other choice." They moved toward the door, each step a calculated risk, each breath another step closer to whatever waited on the other side. The door slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the ship. Just as they stepped into the passage, the lights flickered again, this time with purpose, the glow pulsing faster, brighter, until they almost burned their eyes. The ship was coming alive, its systems responding to their intrusion. The hum, that low, disturbing noise, grew louder, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, until it felt like the ship was breathing in time with their movements. The captain's instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run and never look back. But they couldn't. There was nowhere to go. The deeper they went into the ship, the more tangled they became in its web. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it became. And then they heard it. A voice. Not over the comms. Not from the ship's systems. But from somewhere else entirely. "Leave. Now." The voice was deep, guttural, and unmistakably human. It was not a warning anymore. It was a command. The crew froze, their hearts pounding. The voice was unmistakable, familiar. It was the voice of someone they knew, someone who had been on this ship before them. But who? And where were they? The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but the door ahead beckoned, and beyond it, the answers to the questions they had come for. But with every passing second, they all knew There was no escaping the ship. Not now. Not ever. And the truth was closer than ever. The voice echoed in the narrow passage, leaving a hollow chill that stretched deep into their bones. Leave. Now, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a command, a plea, and the desperation behind it was unmistakable. It reverberated against the metal walls, bouncing back from every corner, as though the ship itself was speaking to them. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. But before anyone could react, a series of harsh clicks filled the air, like a distant set of locks being undone. Captain's grip tightened on the flashlight, the light flickering erratically in her trembling hands. Her first instinct was to turn back, to retreat, but the door before them slid open with a quiet hiss. It was as though it had been waiting for them. She had to push forward. They had no choice now. The unsettling feeling had already rooted itself in their minds. The strange voice, the warnings, the flickering lights, and they could feel the weight of whatever was beyond that door pressing on them. They stepped into the room, cautiously, one by one, the walls around them closing in. The air was thick, cold, and unyielding, but in the center of the chamber, something strange caught their attention. A large glass-like screen flickered to life, displaying a series of cryptic images and flashing symbols they had never seen before. There was no mistaking it now. These weren't random glitches in the ship's systems. It was a message, and it was meant for them. The captain leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The symbols were too alien to decipher quickly, but there was one word that stood out, a name. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it became clearer with every passing second. Wyatt. Her heart skipped a beat. Wyatt, the name that had lingered in her mind from the moment they first boarded this cursed vessel. It was no longer just an anomaly or a coincidence. The voice they'd heard before, the one that urged them to leave it, wasn't from any crew member. It wasn't even from the ship. It was a name from their past. A name that tied them all together. But before she could respond, the ship's light surged again, brighter, almost blinding, and the walls around them began to hum in a way that felt almost alive. The sound was growing louder, more resonant, vibrating through the very core of the ship, shaking the floor beneath their feet. The crew flinched, their hearts racing in their chests. They could feel something powerful stirring deep within the ship. Suddenly, the lights blinked out again, leaving them in complete darkness. Silence swallowed them whole, and the oppressive weight of the void felt suffocating. It was only for a brief moment before the lights returned, but the change in the atmosphere was immediate. The air was heavier now, and their movements felt sluggish, as if they were wading through molasses. Captain's breath became shallow as the faintest sound, like a whisper of wind, curled through the room. But there was no wind. The air was still. Then came the movement. It was like a shadow, indistinct at first, just a flicker at the edge of their vision. But then it grew. It shifted into something tangible, no longer a mere outline, but a distinct humanoid figure. It stood tall and menacing, its form barely visible in the dim light. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, a malfunction in the ship's systems. But it wasn't. The figure was real, its dark silhouette standing impossibly still, as though it had been waiting for them. The crew froze, their instincts screaming at them to run. But the captain stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the figure. The whispering sounds returned, rising and falling, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost as if it was studying them, and then, as if on cue, the lights flickered once more. This time, the room became shrouded in a low, eerie glow, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And in that moment, everything changed. From the shadows emerged another figure. Then another, and another. They were surrounding them now, at least a dozen, maybe more, each one stepping into the faint light. Some were human-like in shape, but others were different. Twisted, distorted versions of humanoid forms, their bodies stretching unnaturally, as if they didn't quite fit into the space they occupied. Their movements were unnerving, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings, jerky and stiff, but with a certain malevolence in their motions. The crew tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing them in with the creatures. The air grew colder, and the oppressive presence in the room felt almost suffocating. One of the figures moved forward, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. It opened its mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the room seemed to vibrate with a low hum, and the captain could feel it inside her head, crawling into her thoughts. The message was clear. They had overstayed their welcome. A sudden jolt of realization struck her. These creatures, they weren't alive in the traditional sense. They were something else, something far worse. The sensation of being watched, of being followed, had never been more intense. Crew's breaths came faster now, panic starting to set in. They had never imagined something like this. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, and they were its latest captives. The figures weren't just trying to frighten them, they were keeping them here. But the tension in the air grew thicker by the second, and just when the captain thought she could take no more, the figures stepped back, retreating into the shadows. The humming died down, and the ship seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for far too long. For a brief moment, there was silence. The crew stood frozen, not daring to move, unsure of whether it was safe or if the silence was just the calm before the storm. Then, without warning, the lights flickered one last time, this time staying off. The ship's system seemed to go dead, as if it had completely shut itself down. The eerie silence returned, but this time it was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, the faintest of footfalls, as though something was approaching from the other side of the room. The captain's pulse raced as the hairs on her neck stood up. Whatever it was, they weren't alone, and they never had been. The shadows in the room shifted again, this time more aggressively. The figures returned, but they weren't standing still anymore. They were moving toward them, not walking, but gliding silent, swift, and terrifyingly close. Panic surged through the crew, and they reached for their weapons, but the figures were faster, their movements too quick for them to react. Suddenly, the captain's communicator buzzed to life. The crackling voice on the other end was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It was the same voice from before, the one they had heard on the comms earlier, the one that had warned them to leave. "Get out. Now, before it's too late. It's already begun. The lights, what they seem." The crew froze, fear coursing through their veins. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It's a countdown. The captain's heart pounded in her chest as the ship's unnatural hum escalated, vibrating through the walls and into their bones. The shadows were closing in, too many, too fast. There was no time to think, no time to plan. All she could do was move, instinct guiding her as her crew huddled together, weapons drawn, eyes darting to the flickering lights overhead. The communicator buzzed again, static drowning out any words, but the urgency was clear. The lights flickered violently, then snapped off entirely. The ship was alive, and it was feeding on their fear. Panic swelled among the crew as they stumbled forward, disoriented, fighting the feeling that they were walking through molasses. The walls seemed to shift, the corridors twisting around them in ways they couldn't understand. Every direction led to more darkness, more shadows. "Keep moving," the captain shouted, her voice barely cutting through the thick silence. She felt it, the creeping presence of the figures, not behind them but ahead, waiting in the blackness. The air was alive with whispers now, a language she couldn't understand, but the cadence, the rhythm, seemed so familiar, as if they were being beckoned home. One of her crew members gasped as a shadow detached itself from the corner, moving toward them faster than she could react. She fired, but the figure didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It simply paused, then dissolved into the air, like smoke evaporating into nothing. And then another appeared, this time behind her, the air growing colder around it. Every time they tried to strike, the figures vanished and reappeared elsewhere, faster, more unpredictable. The captain's mind raced. This wasn't just a fight. It wasn't just a chase. This ship, these things, they weren't bound by the laws of reality. They were playing a game, and they were winning. In that moment, she realized something she had missed before. The figures, the shadows, were not separate entities, not completely independent. They were one with the ship, woven into its fabric, its core. The ship wasn't haunted. It was alive, and it had been waiting for them. As if reading her mind, the walls of the ship seemed to pulse, rippling outward in waves. A blinding light pierced through the darkness, illuminating the faces of the crew. But it wasn't just light, it was warmth, soothing, like a gentle embrace wrapping around them. The shadows withdrew as the captain turned, eyes wide. The space around them began to distort, changing shape, pulling them deeper into the ship's heart. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, guiding them forward. "Move," the captain barked, but her voice cracked as she realized what they were approaching. The heart of the ship. The core. It was at the center, pulsing with light, with energy, with life. They pushed on, fighting the pull of the ship, the insidious hum getting louder in their minds. They had to reach the core, they had to understand what it was, or they would never leave. As they reached the central chamber, the air grew thicker, the hum vibrating through their skulls. There, in the center of the room, a massive structure lay dormant. It resembled something ancient, organic and mechanical at once. Vines of metallic tendrils were woven together, pulsing with energy, converging in the middle like the heart of some great beast. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its heartbeat, as if the ship itself were breathing. The crew stood frozen, captivated by the sight. The walls seemed to stretch, bending in on themselves, as if the very fabric of reality was folding into this place. The captain stepped forward, her legs shaky, her breath shallow. Her eyes were drawn to the center, to the heart of the ship. The figures were there too, but they no longer appeared threatening. They were still, almost reverent, hovering just beyond the glow of the core. She stepped closer, her eyes locking with theirs, trying to understand what they wanted. But then the whispers filled her mind, loud and deafening, and she stumbled back in shock. It wasn't just a ship. It wasn't just a thing waiting for them. It had been alive all along. And the figures, they were part of it. They were its consciousness, its essence. They were the crew, the ship, the passengers. They had become the ship. Before she could process what was happening, a sudden realization cut through her mind. The ship's lights, the whispers, the warnings, everything that had happened since they first boarded had been meant to bring them here. To this point, the crew wasn't simply trapped. They were meant to be part of this place. Part of it. The captain's hands trembled as she reached toward the core. Something called to her. Something deep within her bones, something beyond the physical, was urging her to touch it, to connect, to become part of the ship like all the others before her. She hesitated, heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what would happen if she touched it. Would she become like the others, fading into the walls of the ship? Or would she have the power to break free? She could hear her crew, their panic, their confusion. But the voice inside her was stronger, louder. It told her that this was the only way. The only way to understand it all. She had no choice. With a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the core. The world around her exploded into light. The room, the ship, the figures, they vanished. The very fabric of reality twisted and pulled apart, and the captain felt herself being drawn into a void. There was no light, no dark, no sound. Just endless, stretching emptiness. And then it stopped. She found herself standing alone, as if she had been transported to another plane, another reality. The air was still, but the presence of the ship of the life force she had just touched was all around her. It wasn't gone. It hadn't left. It was within her now, just as it had been within every crew member before her. In that moment, everything became clear. The lights, the whispers, the warnings, they had all been necessary. She was part of something far larger than herself. Something ancient. Something that had always been waiting for humanity to join it. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a living organism, and it had been searching for a crew capable of understanding its purpose. Now, she and her crew were part of that purpose, bound to the ship forever. But then, as she looked into the empty space around her, a single thought struck her. What if this was just the beginning? The ship was alive, yes. But who or what was truly controlling it? And why had it chosen them? The whispers returned, louder this time. She could feel the answers swirling around her, but they were just out of reach, slipping away like sand through her fingers. And then, before she could fully comprehend it all, a voice echoed in her mind. Welcome home. And everything went dark. The darkness pressed in from all sides, an oppressive weight that seemed to close in tighter with every breath the captain took. She couldn't see, couldn't feel the edges of the world around her, but she was acutely aware of an overwhelming presence. She was no longer alone. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, more insistent. They surrounded her, sinking into her thoughts, drowning her in their cold, ancient rhythm. Welcome home. The voice reverberated through her mind, and she felt her body respond, as if the words were physically pulling at her, connecting her to something beyond her understanding. The air thickened, the silence becoming more pronounced, and then she felt a subtle shift. The ground beneath her feet seemed to quiver. No, she was shifting. Her surroundings were changing, warping like liquid metal, flowing into new shapes. It was only a moment before the darkness receded, and light, soft but penetrating, began to bloom in the distance. As if pulled by an invisible force, she took a step forward, then another. Her heart raced with anticipation, the beating quick and erratic in her chest. She didn't know what awaited her in this strange void, this new reality, but she couldn't turn back. There was no turning back now. The light intensified, growing stronger as she moved forward, the whispers fading into an eerie silence. The world ahead of her took shape, revealing a vast expanse, unlike anything she had seen before. It was a chamber, or perhaps a space, larger than any known structure, but with no discernible walls or boundaries. The ceiling was an endless stretch of stars, galaxies, and nebulae, swirling in an unholy dance. The floor was smooth, reflective, like polished glass, and beneath her feet, she could feel the ship's pulse, the thrum of energy coursing through the very ground. And there, at the center of this infinite space, was a being. It was unlike anything she had ever imagined, its form constantly shifting, liquid and solid, light and shadow. Its outline was human in shape, but it transcended the limits of human understanding. She couldn't comprehend its true form, only that it was both everywhere and nowhere. Every movement, every flicker in its being, a combination of both power and fragility. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling, unsure whether she spoke out loud or whether her thoughts had spoken the words instead. The being's shape seemed to ripple, as if considering her question. Then, slowly, its features began to solidify into something that resembled a face, one not bound by the flesh of humanity, but a visage that was ancient, ageless, infinite. "We are the architects of this vessel," it spoke, its voice resonating not just in her ears, but deep within her soul. "We are the ones who have watched, who have waited. We are the ones who have sought." The captain felt the cold shiver run down her spine. Sought for what? The being's form pulsed again, and she could feel its gaze settling on her. Sought the truth. Sought the evolution. Sought those who could understand. You, Captain, and your crew, you were meant to find us. To be one with us. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning like the galaxies overhead. She had thought this was about survival, about escaping the haunted ship. But this was something far more profound. But why us? Why my crew? The being seemed to pause, the rippling in its form slowing as though it were weighing the answer carefully. Because you, like the others before you, have within you the spark. The spark that can unlock what we have sought for eons. The knowledge, the power, the truth of all things. Your kind, humanity, holds the key. She struggled to process the information. What do you want from us? What are we supposed to do? The being's presence became more intense, its form swelling with energy as if to convey a deep, ancient sorrow. You will become part of us, as your predecessors did. We have waited for the right moment, for the right people to understand our purpose and to help us continue what we started long ago. You have no choice, the being said softly, yet with a finality that made her stomach churn. You will be part of us. You have already begun the transition. Your thoughts are connected to ours. Your mind, your soul, it is already entwined with this vessel. With us. Her breath caught in her throat, panic clawing at her chest. She felt it, the subtle shift in her own mind, the echo of the ship's consciousness whispering inside her thoughts. It was so familiar, so natural, as if this had been her purpose all along. As if everything in her life had led her to this moment. I won't. She tried to find her words, but the words became blurred, fading in her mind as the connection deepened, as if she were being pulled under the surface of a great, endless ocean. Her body trembled with the force of it, her sense of self slipping away. You will, the being replied, its voice a soft promise. You are already. Her vision blurred as the ship's pulse grew louder, vibrating in her chest. She felt herself slipping. The crew around her, they were already lost, already part of the ship's life force. And now she could feel herself merging with them, becoming one with the very structure that had haunted them. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out everything else, until the last vestiges of her individuality began to fade. Just as she felt herself being pulled into the vastness of the ship, something snapped inside her, a moment of clarity. Her hands shot out, grasping for the control panel nearby, for the only thing that might give her a chance. She reached, fingers trembling, and then she slammed her palm against it. For a brief second, everything stopped. The connection snapped, the lights flickered, and the pulsing hum of the ship slowed. The captain's mind cleared, her vision sharp once again. She was still herself, still human, but she knew now. The ship had revealed its true nature, and she couldn't escape it. The crew, the whispers, they had become part of the machine, the collective consciousness of the ship. She had felt the weight of their decision, their evolution. But now, she understood something deeper, something far darker. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a prison, a tool of transformation that had, over time, taken in countless souls, forcing them to join its endless cycle. And it was only a matter of time before the same thing happened to her. She had won this battle. She had escaped the ship's grasp, at least for now. But there was no way out. Not for her. Not for anyone. Not unless she destroyed the ship. And yet, even as the thought crossed her mind, the being's voice echoed again in her head. It's already too late. You are part of us now. The lights flickered again, and her crew stirred. They were no longer the people she had known. They were something else. Something vast, ancient, powerful. And as she stood there, heart racing, knowing what she had to do, the final thought whispered through her mind. She could destroy the ship, but at what cost? And so the question lingered unanswered as the lights dimmed around her.